We'll start the cloud recording. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this chat panel discussion on contemporary First Amendment politics. My name is Nick Wilson, and I'm one of the co-secretaries of the chat network, which means I'm basically responsible for facilitating and producing things like this. And we've got a wonderful panel assembled today that is surrounding some of the work of Edgar Esparza from Cal State University, Los Angeles. And our speakers are going to feature Veridiana Alimonti from the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Gabriel Brahm from Northern Michigan University, Alwyn from Singapore Management University, and AunRika Tucker-Shabazz from the University of Michigan. So without further ado, I will stop talking and ask Louis to orient us a little bit before we hear from Veridiana.
Okay, hi everybody. Can you hear me? Yes, okay, excellent. So thank you for coming, and thanks especially to the panelists who have been extremely patient with the organizing of this panel, which has gone on for a month with various changes in formatting, etc. I'm very excited to have all of them here from different countries, etc. Alwyn is coming to us from Singapore, Alwyn Lim at Singapore Management University. Gabriel Brahm is at Michigan, even though I think you're in Israel right now, is that correct?
Currently in Haifa, okay. Israel.
Currently in Haifa. Veridiana Alimonti, who is from Brazil, but currently in the United States. And myself, who is usually in California, but right now I am in Brazil. So Veridiana and I have swapped places. And I'm having a few technical issues, but you can hear me and you can see me, so it should be okay, and I should be able to get my slides up eventually. That's about it. Thank you all of you for coming. With no further ado, let's continue on with what we have scheduled for today. I think the first speaker will go into the order of the program. So the first speaker will be Veridiana Alimonti.
Thank you. I'll share my screen mainly with references of things that I will mention during the intervention. So let's see. Can you see that? Great. So good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank Professor Esparza for this kind invitation and to read the other panelists. Also apologize because I'll have to leave earlier given another commitment previously scheduled, but you have my mail, and if you have any further questions, we can continue the debate later on. So I want to bring, I'm from Electronic Frontier Foundation, and I work with Latin American organizations in different topics regarding privacy, freedom of expression. And I want to bring a perspective from Latin America and international human rights standards on the intersection of freedom of expression and privacy as a contribution to our debate. And before I go on, I want to take a glimpse on the Latin American context, considering the hurdles of content moderation that Professor Esparza addresses in his article. And looking at concerns about social networks and internet platforms' amplification of hateful content and harassing content. As we know, this phenomenon is a symptom of much more complex and systemic societal problems that come before and go beyond international internet platforms themselves. But at the same time, it's true that platforms can play a role in feeding back into that turmoil. However, blunt and white responses that focus on monitoring and filtering types of speech through automated tools put in place by big tech companies, often unaware of specific local contexts, are a known recipe for failure. For example, while in Brazil, civil society has been legitimately worried about polarization and disinformation strategies relying on internet platforms put in motion by President Bolsonaro and his supporters to undermine Brazilian democracy, Colombians, and this is a report by Fundación Carisma that is in Colombia, Colombians have seen their government use the stain of disinformation and terrorism to discredit and attack those speaking out online about police brutality during protests that spread across the country in 2021. Repeatedly, content moderation for hate speech and graphic violence actually takes down content calling out discrimination, police brutality, and war crimes. More often than not, content moderation practices perpetuate forms of discrimination against vulnerable groups. And this is another report from Mexico 19 Mexico that published a report based on interviews they conducted with people from marginalized communities. And it highlights that almost 90% of the respondents had content removed from their accounts that was directly linked to the vindication of their identities, human rights, or political activism. Most of them said the platform, as you may imagine, did not explain why they had their content censored. Together with a coalition of civil and academic organizations, EFF revamped the Santa Clara Principles on Transparency and Accountability in Content Moderation in late 2021, putting forward foundational and operational principles for internet platforms in order to bring greater transparency, due process, consistency, and cultural competence for content moderation. Yet, when it comes to infrastructure providers like ISPs and domain name registrars, for example, there are inherent obstacles to make tailored content interventions and ensure transparency in the process along the way. This leads us to take a different approach and advocate for infrastructure providers to be neutral and don't intervene in the content they host. We also see a regulatory wave coming up with the approval of the Digital Services Act in the European Union and similar proposals popping up in Latin American countries. And now adding the privacy bit to the mixture and international human rights standards, both the Inter-American Human Rights System and the United Nations human rights bodies have stressed that the right to privacy is an essential requirement for the realization of the right to freedom of expression and opinion. Undue interference with the right to privacy can both directly and indirectly limit the free development and exchange of ideas. And under both human rights systems, the Inter-American and the universal one, freedom of expression includes the right to seek, to speak, communicate, and access information. Much has already been said on the deleterious effect communication surveillance has on these rights. Back in 2013, 2014, EFF spearheaded a global coalition of civil society, privacy, and technology experts that drafted the 13 principles on the applications of human rights to communication surveillance. And already at that time, we emphasized that legal safeguards ensured in the context of state communication surveillance have traditionally built on an approach of surveillance invasiveness that relied on artificial and formalistic categories of communications data, separating communications content, metadata, and subscriber information that identify us online. Regardless of the context, this formalistic separation considered communications content the most invasive type of information, treating non-content data as an inherently less sensitive kind of information that deserves a lower degree of protection. However, each of these types of information might, taken alone or analyzed collectively, reveal a lot about ourselves and our movements and interactions over time. In many Latin American countries, which is not very different from the US actually, legal safeguards grant a second-class protection to metadata when it is sought by law enforcement, for example, without the requirement of a previous judicial order. Such distinctions of categories of communications data has always been promoted by a known cybercrime convention held by the Council of Europe, known as Budapest Convention, that was open for signature back in 2001. Non-members of the Council of Europe, like the US and some Latin American countries, have acceded to the convention, which was the first comprehensive international agreement on cybercrime that harmonized substantive and procedural criminal legislation, setting surveillance powers to law enforcement authorities and cooperation obligations to service providers. More recently, the Council of Europe approved a new protocol to that convention, focusing on access to user data by foreign law enforcement authorities in criminal investigations. And this protocol reinforces the idea that subscriber identification information, like our name and address, or even IP addresses, are inherently less sensitive and do not allow precise conclusions concerning the private lives and daily habits of individuals' concerns. But on the contrary, subscriber data is crucial to identifying us and linking us to our activities, relations, and movements. We published this guide that poses concerns about the text of the new protocol, highlighting how the lack of proper safeguards when disclosing subscriber information puts people at risk. The interrelation between privacy and free expression also shows a strong connection with the right to protest, both online and on the streets. For example, in early 2020, Chile's prosecutor's office sought to obtain all mobile phone numbers that had connected to antennas in Santiago's subway stations, where fires marked the beginning of the country's 2019 social uprising and protests. By obtaining the mobile phone numbers, it would be possible to identify their owners located in the protest zones. Authorities in the US made similar requests based on the connection of subscriber information and location data in the context of Black Lives Matter demonstrations. The massive implementation of face recognition technologies raised similar concerns regarding, among others, the right to protests. Cameras powered with face recognition systems are capable of uniquely identifying and track people on a massive scale. The movement to ban government use of face recognition builds both on the disparate impact of this technology on vulnerable groups and a dimension of privacy in the public space and on privacy's foundation role to human autonomy and agency. We had important court decisions halting face recognition in public spaces in Brazil and more recently in Argentina. In our times, not being tracked in each and every step we make online and offline is both an ever-increasing challenge and an imperative for the enjoyment of fundamental freedoms and human rights. And here, encryption also, and particularly end-to-end encryption, plays a fundamental role, not only for one-on-one communication, but to enable collective resistance and organization, which underlines that privacy has also a collective dimension. The rights to privacy of communications and freedom of expression include the right to use encryption technology. Service providers should be able to design systems for end-to-end privacy, and internet intermediaries should not block the transmission of any encrypted communication. Yet, the current use of malicious software like Pegasus by governments to spy on human rights defenders, activists, journalists, opposition leaders, circumvent encryption protections, and reinforce the fundamental role of those developing secure technologies and researching vulnerabilities in systems and devices we all rely on. However, what we see in the region is the abusive use of vague and overbroad cybercrime laws to persecute vulnerability researchers and developers of secure software. This is the first one here. The pink report here is a report published by Access Now with many cases of persecution of information security researchers in Latin America. In 2018, we published this other report, Coders' Rights in America, that builds on inter-American standards on freedom of expression as safeguards for those researching vulnerabilities in the region. And this other post here talks about the Olabini's trial. Olabini is an internationally known free software developer that is facing unfounded criminal charges in Ecuador in a slow motion trial fraught with irregularities. And we've been reporting about that since 2019. So our freedom to speak, access information, communicate, organize, and protest are human rights, but are not a given. Technology can enhance the enjoyment of such rights and help to empower the voice of those previously silenced or excluded. Yet, decisions over technology architecture by companies or to government pressure can replicate censorship of vulnerable groups, intensify surveillance of those who speak up, and stifle dissent by default. Debates like this are all the more important to preserve the level playing field for speech and democracy. So thank you again for the opportunity to join the discussion and be here with you.
All right, thank you very much. So next in line, we are going to hear from Gabriel Brahm from Northern Michigan University. Thank you. You are muted, Gabriel.
Thanks, Nicholas. My remarks today are a response to Louis Esparza's excellent piece, which is the occasion for our gathering. I recommend it to anyone listening who hasn't had a chance to read it. Juxtaposed beside the dramatic circumstances of yesterday's 20th century heroes of free speech, so aptly nominated and helpfully invoked for us by Louis Edgar Esparza in his important agenda-setting article, a look at today's contemporary First Amendment politics, by contrast, reveals relatively depressing prospects for political freedom under a pall of what the sociologist also refers to no less aptly, albeit colloquially, as cancel culture. Indeed, so far from eliciting old-fashioned displays of civic virtue by courageous individuals acting openly in concert with fellow citizens for the sake of collective ideals destined to be preserved in memory by legend, folk song, Emmy Award-winning PBS documentaries, and history itself with a capital H, the frustrating newfangled predicament of 21st century speaking subjects in America has very oft of late been termed Kafkaesque. You can see this word thrown around a lot, is what I'm saying. Nancy McDermott, for example, uses it to talk about the multiple months-long Title IX investigations of the feminist cultural critic Laura Kipnis, charged repeatedly in recent years with creating a hostile environment for women on the Northwestern campus where she teaches. How so? Ostensibly by publishing articles in respected outlets such as the Chronicle of Higher Education, where Kipnis is critical of none other than the very excesses of Title IX over-enforcement and those moral panics it induces concerning non-existent phenomena like toxic masculinity, rape culture, microaggressions, and so on, which she has been accused of fomenting by discussing them critically in the pages of the Chronicle of Higher Education. In each case, Kipnis was exonerated, but other than surviving her ordeals, what was accomplished? That's the problem. Instead of leaving us with inspiring examples, today's censorship campaigns create only warnings to others. Don't let this happen to you. You could be next, so shut the fuck up. In other words, our specifically Kafkaesque dilemmas per se are the opposite of heroic. They're anti-heroic, not even tragic, miserable to be sure, but lacking in tragedy's edifying payoff of intellectually revealing clarification and emotionally satisfying catharsis, comic perhaps, but then only darkly so, and when seen from outside at a sufficient distance. Whereas to actually go through it yourself, God forbid, is to endure a kind of torture. There's nothing funny about a medical doctor's prescription for psychoactive pharmaceuticals like Xanax, Ativan, or any of the myriads of SSRIs half one's colleagues seem to be on nowadays to calm their jangled nerves, flayed raw by the daily, hourly insult to one's dignity that is the modern workplace. Moreover, what so appalls is precisely the lack of anything like Esparza's soapbox-style social action, free speech, political freedom, or other cutouts or stand-ins for that priceless Hegelian intersubjective recognition of individual autonomy said to be integral to a normal person's mental health and thus so beloved of the object relations school of psychological theory. I'm thinking, of course, about Melanie Klein, Fairbairn, Kohut, but also more recently, Jessica Benjamin, whose musings on perverse desire will feature momentarily in my conclusion. For indeed, if the modern corporation, and the university has become a corporation, were categorized according to canons of political science, leaving psychology aside for a moment, considered as analogous to a form of government, or what the Straussians call regime, it would surely have to be labeled as totalitarian. And though it is true that in his own day, Franz Kafka himself got laughs, intentionally, of course, at public readings of works like The Metamorphosis, easy to imagine. Nonetheless, his protagonist, Gregor Samsa, wasn't laughing when they dumped his desiccated carcass in the trash. Likewise, in the trial, Joseph K. may pretend at moments to find amusement in his own ordeal, but as a failed attempt at regaining agency by reframing his humiliation as one big misunderstanding, it's a pathetic bluff. Meaningless rather than emblematic, much less worthy of myth-making storytelling designed to stimulate emulation in an audience moved by admiration to rededicate itself to its own best founding principles by means of patriotic action in defense of a self-respecting polity's honorable Republican, small r, tradition. The life of a Kafka character is one of enduring interest to nobody, not even or least of all himself or herself or themselves. To say Kafkaesque, in other words, as we may recall from AP English as it once was taught, but yet fail to appreciate sufficiently when the issue is not the SAT test as once administered, but our very lives themselves that are at stake as we live them out under the conditions of Esparza's cancel culture, is to say absurd, is to say abject. Moreover, another word of similar literary pedigree applied as frequently to the scene of desolation Esparza worries over is, of course, Orwellian. And if only Aldous Huxley had had a more adaptable surname, a more euphonious equivalent of Huxleyan would doubtless be in common usage as well. Huxlarius, perhaps, I suggest we may start to make use of. But wait, what am I saying? Esparza himself in his article provides us the key to the specifically literary meaning of his avowedly sociological sketch, invoking as he does himself none less than the great Albert Camus and his notion of cynical revolutions that obliterate the lines between left and right in order to impose more than the means to anything positive aimed at any end or worthy goal, simply the monotonous reign of intolerance for its own sake, for the sake of intolerance as an end in itself, or for the sake of Sigmund Freud's death drive, which is to say the same thing another way. And that returns us to Jessica Benjamin, whose 1988 classic text, The Bonds of Love, I have alluded to already. With this work of daring psychoanalytic speculation in mind, Pseudo-liberalism is my own made-up word for both what's lacking and overly present in our current situation. With this modest neologism, I mean to simply emphasize something of the woke libidinal economy that makes it so dizzyingly absurd and deliriously productive of abjection. For my admittedly hermeneutical claim in conclusion is that when the repression of proscribed enjoyment, such as racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, anti-Semitic, or other cancelable sentiments, becomes the enjoyment of that very same prescribed repression, thanks to the human subject's own innately perverse, super egoic investment of affect in the very process itself of disciplining its own excesses so that the means become an end in themselves, then sadism is at work in the service of liberty. By the same token, conservatives become masochists when they appear to actively derive a modicum of satisfaction from their own manifest symptoms of powerlessness on display in an increasingly closed system dedicated to ceaseless progressivism, if not progress, at all costs. In any case, as Esparza puts it, we are for now caught in a trend that necessarily stymies social action. And my wager, my guess, if you prefer, in any case my modest contribution to our dialogue is to suggest that far from the unintended consequences beloved of sociologists, following in the tracks of Robert K. Merton, social action doesn't just happen to stop. For if by social action we mean the freedom to determine one's own fate, let's not forget Fyodor Dostoevsky's claim, put into the mouth of his satanic Grand Inquisitor, nothing has ever been more unendurable to man and human society than freedom. More concretely, and I leave you with this thought, until we defund the thought police, by which I mean dismantle the bloated DEI, CRT, HR, LGBTQIA2S+ intersectional feminist bureaucracy that governs our institutions of higher education today in totalitarian Kafkaesque fashion. Our schools will continue to propagandize rather than teach, indoctrinate rather than educate, and manufacture occasions for hysterical overreaction to perceived offense. I'd fuck that tiger, to quote from Esparza's article, will get you suspended from Twitter, etc., etc., because it is libidinally satisfying or enjoyable for those pseudo-liberals who are in charge and whose worldview commits them first and foremost to staying as angry as possible. Even while masochistic conservatives, though far fewer in number in our universities, in the high-tech industry, Hollywood, and mainstream media, consent willy-nilly to go on serving as their punching bags. In short, it's as Peter Wood has said, and I quote now to wrap up. This is Peter Wood. The anger on campus directed at dissenters from favored causes is not the result of students in the group hug feeling threatened. It is the cause. The students, bereft of both an emotional center and a larger purpose, increasingly turn to ideologies that can provide a substitute for both creeds of resentment. Rather than vindictive protectiveness at work, what we see is preemptive belligerence. The angry person, boy or girl, needs something to be angry about. Many things can fit the bill: Black Lives Matter, the campus rape crisis, Palestinians, illegal immigrants, dreamers, inequality, etc. The issues are disparate, but their emotional dynamics are nearly identical. Each identifies a terrible injustice that has been not so much unnoticed as actively denied due attention by powerful, malevolent forces. Structural racism, patriarchy, Islamophobia, nativism, the 1%, and of course, big oil, not to mention, I would add now, and this is me speaking, the Jews, and certainly the state of Israel, where I now happen to be sitting. Cancel culture is an exercise in institutionalized scapegoating, in other words, a practice as old as time, and so I fear we have not come into sight even of the end of it. Realistically, for now, therefore, parents should stop sending their kids to colleges that are no longer real colleges until or unless they resume their proper mission. Thank you. That's it.
Okay, great. Thank you, Gabriel, for that very provocative intervention. I hope that people will engage with what you said. Our panel is not just international, but also interdisciplinary. You haven't been able to tell. So while most of us may be social scientists, Gabriel's in the humanities. So we'll try to have some interdisciplinary engagement here as well. Next, we have Alwyn Lim from Singapore Management University, who I'm very happy to have on the panel as well. And also, I'm joined by one of my students here on the video. All right, thank you. Take it away, Alwyn.
All right, thanks so much, Lewis. I think, Lewis initially invites me to be part of this panel, I think because of my work on corporate social responsibility.
Sorry, Alwyn, I'm just going to interrupt you for 1 second. I meant to correct the fact that I had forgot to introduce AunRika Tucker-Shabazz, who will be giving commentary, and I think I forgot because of my technical difficulties I'm having.
Oh, yeah,
so I
sure.
apologize. But yeah, go ahead, continue, Alwyn. Sorry for that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so I think, Lewis invited me to be part of this panel because of my work on corporate social responsibility. So I'm an organizational sociologist who studies corporate engagement with issues like human rights and the environment. So when Lewis first proposed this topic to me, I thought it would be quite interesting to examine sort of the involvement of corporations in the policing of the freedom of speech. So I initially intended to touch on many sort of issues, but I think, the two previous speakers have already covered quite a lot of what I wanted to cover. So instead of doing that, I think what I'll try to do is sort of suggest what I think are 5 possible sociological factors that are influencing corporations, and by corporations, I mean mostly big tech and social media companies. So 5 possible sociological factors that are maybe influencing these corporations to actively intervene in the policing of the freedom of speech on their platforms. Now, before I get into the 5 sort of factors, I would sort of like to highlight 2 sort of contextual issues. The first sort of contextual issue is really that a lot of this policing of the freedom of speech on social media platforms, on big tech, I think recently basically came about because of a series of public emergencies, right? So for example, in the United States, you had what happened with the 2020 US presidential election, and as well as the COVID pandemic. So I think a lot of the policing of free speech on social media was actually carried out under the auspices of these public emergencies. And the second sort of contextual, kind of large contextual issue, I think really is what I think is a broad social demographic shift occurring right now among young people, right? So not only in the United States, but across the world, that sort of predisposes them to not have the same type of orientation to freedom of speech as with people in previous generations. So with those 2 things in mind, let me just kind of give you a sketch of the 5 sort of sociological factors that I think are involved in corporate intervention in the policing of free speech. Now, none of these 5 factors that I'm going to sketch out are sort of mutually exclusive. I think probably all of them would be working in concert with one another. So the first sociological factor, I think, would be the most obvious one, and that is co-optation. And what we have in co-optation is when governments work in concert with technology companies, with social media companies. And again, this is usually quite pressing in times of emergency. So, for example, during the COVID pandemic, where social media companies would try to stop the dissemination of messages, or they would tag messages with warning labels. And usually the concern here was to prevent vaccine hesitancy, to prevent the spread of, for example, misinformation about COVID. But there's also been some evidence that there has been a sort of censorship of opposing political messages. So I mentioned earlier the 2020 US presidential elections, and on January 6, issues like questioning election integrity. So in sort of an article that was published about a month ago, I think in The Intercept, I think apparently there were documents that were revealed that the tech companies, so we're talking about Twitter, Facebook, Reddit, Discord, many of these tech companies had been revealed to have met monthly with the FBI, with the Department of Homeland Security. So I think one sort of sociological factor that's quite significant here is co-optation, right? Governments working in concert with technology companies to police the freedom of speech. The second sort of broad sociological factor is what I would refer to as the sort of demographic self-selection of persons who end up working in big tech or in the social media companies. I think over the generations, what we've been seeing is sort of a broad shift of values and preferences among the younger generation. And we're talking broadly here about millennials and Gen Z. So for example, among young people aged between the ages of 18 and 29, 63% are more likely to vote Democratic. Between the ages of 30 and 44, about slightly more than half are more likely to vote Democrat in the US. Among the millennials and Gen Z, these are also most likely to be the target audience of tech companies. It is also this sort of demographic group that are also most likely to want to work in these technology companies. Among the sort of social media and big tech companies, I'm sure you've seen the charts before, the majority of the employee donations to political parties from these companies end up going overwhelmingly to the Democratic Party in the US. So over 90% of employee donations for companies like Netflix, Twitter, Airbnb, Apple, Google, Facebook, PayPal go overwhelmingly to one political party over another political party. So it's sort of reasonable, I think, to sort of assume that with this demographic self-selection into social media companies, into big tech companies, that the employees of these companies would view threats to freedom of speech as primarily coming from the opposing political party. So with this demographic self-selection, this leads me to kind of my third point, which is also related to demography, and that, and this is my third sociological factor, which is what I call the leadership or the elite theory. This really targets the sort of the current founders and leaders of many of these big tech companies and these social media companies. Many of these tech companies were founded and led by individuals from Generation X. So Facebook, for example, definitely Twitter, and Generation X, many of these early founders of these companies began with the idea that technology could really be a force for liberation. And most of these individuals from Generation X were sort of generally anti-establishment in the 90s. And so what they wanted to do was they sought to create sort of organizational cultures that were different from traditional companies. And this might explain why they have aligned themselves with specific political parties over other political parties. A fourth possible sort of sociological factor that I think is sort of pushing these big tech and social media companies towards intervening in free speech would be the professions theory. Now, because a lot of social media and big tech companies are sort of outward facing entities, they are much more visible than sort of your regular small business. Because a lot of these big tech companies are outward facing, many of them are extremely conscious of their self-presentation. And although a lot of social media companies, for example, are supported by engineers and coders, these are also companies that rely a lot on advertising and marketing professionals. We can imagine that persons that would have credentials in advertising and marketing who end up working in social media companies also tend towards certain types of political values. And sort of the fifth and last broad sociological category that I'm thinking about is what I would refer to as competition. And in competition, information is usually seen as a commodity. And what happens is that groups in society compete to have their version of information disseminated to the broader society. Now, one way to do this, you can imagine, would be to have a free market of information where the best ideas sort of win out in the end. But if we think of information in the context of competition, there is also another alternative that the social media companies seem to have adopted, and that is to view their position as being one of a monopoly on information. And how do you achieve a monopoly of information? This can be achieved through the censorship of alternative views. So those are kind of broadly the five sort of broad sociological factors that I think are at play when it comes to corporations and the policing of the freedom of speech: co-optation, demographic self-selection, leaders and the elite, professions, and competition. So maybe just by way of conclusion, I'd just like to say that I think these sociological dynamics will likely persist, and there would be a continued dominance of free speech by these corporate gatekeepers. Again, just to kind of bring you back to the overall context, I think what we're seeing here is a very broad kind of social demographic shift. And it seems that people of the younger generation really do not have much of an appetite for views that they think are politically incorrect. And I think what we're seeing now is sort of a shift into sort of a more of a Singapore style of media censorship across the world, where there's a relatively free flow of information, except for certain hot button issues, like the incitement of violence, misinformation about pandemics, and so forth. Okay, all right, thank you. That's all I have.
All right, wonderful. Thank you, Alwyn. And so now we are going to turn to our penultimate speaker, AunRika Tucker-Shabazz. AunRika, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you all. Can you hear me? Awesome. Okay. So thank you all. I really appreciate Professor Esparza allowing me to be a part of the panel. I really appreciated the other panelists' discussions as well. I have three things that I want to do today in my time. I want to summarize what I understood, or sort of tell the story of how I understood what Professor Esparza was doing and what I interpreted the presentation as. And then I want to walk you through two case examples of what I'm talking about. One based on horror and this question of freedom of speech, horror, and social media in 19th and 20th century American empire. And then the second thing, or the third thing I want to do is kind of pitch some other things that I'm thinking about as it especially relates to my dissertation topic, which is a comparative historical approach to incest in American empire as well. So the first thing is that what I appreciated in Professor Esparza's article, which again, I believe is necessary and should should be read is an attention to a very public-oriented understanding of censorship, and then what role social media has played within a sort of politics of the public sphere, and primarily this kind of private communication, interpersonal communication that that becomes mass communication, and that social media is a sort of public interpretation of that. When I left reading the article, I thought to myself, I'm having a different experience, because when I pay attention to, in particular, the representation of free speech, immediately what came to mind was Ida B. Wells, and the fact that her literal publishing newspaper was called Free Speech. And so what's happening in the late 19th century within the idea of free speech and free press, and how for Black women especially, those are when you speak of one, you're speaking of the other. Those institutions of the free press is linked to free speech, and not just that, but then for public education as well. And so I want to use horror as my first example of when I was reading the article. I was like, well, what's happening within another form of communication, mass communication, which is film right now and television, especially around horror. Black women's agency picks up what I believe Ida B. Wells starts with, this racialization of horror as a uniquely American empirical genre. Before this, you have tragedy, you have Greek tragedies, right? In a lot of ways, you have horror, you have drama, and a lot of push in performance theater in particular as a different politicized space other than sort of policies and urban policies, but looking at the way that Ida B. Wells at the end of the 19th century, with free speech as her the name of her printing press, Free Press Organization. It's a colored newspaper. And it's the fact that for her, she invents a new application of statistical data science to represent white crime as a form of sociologically relevant urban violence. And so this is 1892. She's publishing these political pamphlets, and some important things happen in that her work, Southern Horrors is this first attempt at a Black feminist Black take on the Black Reconstruction. So her contemporary, who is well known and accepted within sociology at the right now, W.E.B. Du Bois, what it means to situate the political pamphlets of Ida B. Wells, who is a Black woman who is an editor of a colored newspaper. It's named Free Speech, and that her reporting at this time actually leads to her exile from Memphis. Her business is shut down, under threat, burned down, in fact, and her white counterpart, actually, so her co-owner, who was a white man, is also forced to leave Memphis, is also exiled. And so this unique moment for me around not only the language of free speech, Professor Esparza's topic, but what happened in the in the move from the 19th to the 20th century history of American horror, which all I've ever heard is Alfred Hitchcock, Stand in the Mirror, Alfred Hitchcock, and Psycho, which comes in the 1960s. And so what happens with Ida B. Wells and Alfred Hitchcock walk into a bar right after ASA? Like, what are they talking about? What kind of conversation would they be happening? And why are we more familiar with a particular narrative of horror as narrated by white men? So the sort of scientific contemporary Sigmund Freud, who has been quoted here, right? There is a scientific narrative about the psychology of violence, and the communication of violence in particular, that repression is this mechanism. And then you have Du Bois and Durkheim in sociology, who are also thinking about sort of post-colonial violence, if you will, and post-Reconstruction in particular. But Ida B. Wells is exiled because of a particular application of statistical data science that makes urban crime that makes white urban crime fundamental to the Black Reconstruction. And I think that was my sort of first point, is to situate this free speech, this exile tradition, and in particular, why Ida B. Wells's approach to historical methods and data science is actually useful for understanding why people talk about Alfred Hitchcock and Psycho as the origin of American horror. In one of these, you have one form of mass communication and free speech, which was the free colored newspapers and the press. But the segregation of not only Ida B. Wells, censorship, if you will, the censorship of Ida B. Wells, for me, in my reading of the situation, sociology can take up Du Bois. Ida B. Wells was expelled from college long before she was exiled from Memphis under threat of lynching. She was expelled from her college in Rust College in Mississippi. And so thinking about this repeated moment in Ida B. Wells's history and how she comes to publish Southern Horrors in 1892, this specific address in 1899 called A Red Record, the opening line in A Red Record is specifically addressed to the American student of sociology, right? So she's writing from outside of the academy, but she is addressing in particular the American student of sociology at the time. 1960, thinking about free speech, Black women's agency, and the tradition of horror in film, this is the way that white cultural memory begins, is the theme of death and resurrection, which is a really important component in Ida B. Wells's research on lynching. And it's something that for me, as I move to my second point, how for Black women in particular, their agency in the 21st century around imaging horror. Most people are aware of Jordan Peele right now. You might have seen Nope, Us, Them, but you might not know that he also has done an animated children's horror film called Wendell and Wild, which takes up the same theme of death and resurrection, which in particular for Ida B. Wells's work is a religious interpretation and expression of mob violence. It's explicitly a political theology of Black Reconstruction. That is statistical data application of the ways that white men are enacting religious collective violence against the free and the enslaved. So this moment around, if you pay attention to Black women's agency in the 19th century and the 20th century, there's nothing that is sort of about horror, but we get Toni Morrison and this narrative about racial terrorism and the study of death and resurrection in that context. But Jordan Peele's horror films are, in particular, Honk for Jesus, Save Your Soul is my response to what I would say to Professor Esparza at the end, which is that within the narrative of cancel culture, sort of Black women were kind of seen as these like embodied agitators. Like if you like whatever a Black woman is saying or whatever a Black professor is writing, the sort of use of FOIA against critical race professors who had received funds and money, whose work was on critical race theory, this use again of being able to interrogate Black women's knowledge production, censor their knowledge production within the academy, whether it's explicitly on race or not, but kind of this revival in the past several years. But thinking about what happens if you trace free speech, horror into mass forms of social media and communication. In film, you get this, you're paying attention to the revival of imaging horror for Black communities. And that is very hopeful for many moviegoers, where traditionally the story is Alfred Hitchcock, American Psycho. There's even a long-running white television show, American Horror Story, right? That rarely features Black characters, but when they do, they're voodoo. There's their voodoo queen, so a particular religious representation. But Honk for Jesus, Save Your Soul, and Wendell and Wild take up the particularly American empire understanding of horror as racialized, religious and creating a religious interpretation of collective violence against Black people. And then I wanted to end and say that in my research, just kind of briefly, I would say that on the topic of incest, and I would love to hear more. I think I've been in the chat space before, but just in my research, I respond and say that when paying attention to free speech about incest and child sexual abuse amongst racialized communities, that what's been happening is a crucifying of the canon, and that crucifying the canon is necessary. It's a necessary and sufficient step towards decolonizing the sociological canon, in particular around collective theories of violence that do not rely on a psychological damaged internal self in order to recognize democratic speech and the freedom of speech. And so I say that Black authors who have written about incest and child sexual abuse particularly situate, like Ida B. Wells does, incest as a form of collective violence. Its religious and colonial origins of incest before slavery in order to create a continuous narrative, and that censorship is responded to by returning to the origins of incest within Western culture, which was performance theater, was not the law, but in fact, public theater. And so displacing the idea of the Oedipus complex, the Freudian psychoanalysis tradition, and all of the generative feminist literature that came out of it, but presenting a more material approach that centers religious and racial capitalism. And that was about the 17th century. So tis pity she's a whore, the first graphic approach, which was performed by the Queen's Court. But it was a graphic approach to depicting interfamily sexual relations within a religious interpretation. And so I take up the one theme of return to performance theater as the most democratic approach for empowering survivors of incest and child sexual abuse, and that this is a tradition in the 20th and 21st century that has remained. And then I also look at the free press, the ways that African-American print cultures, such as short films and speculative fiction, create a more continuous narrative than academic social science research, which has historically excluded the agency and subjectivity of Black women, as well as Black male victims of child sexual abuse. And I think that's my time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, AunRika. And so now, Louis, we've got a few minutes for you to respond. There's clearly nothing to respond to anywhere here. There's no issues brought up. But it's your opportunity to take the floor for a few minutes, and I'll just advertise anybody who'd like to get a question in the queue, feel free to either direct message me or put it in the chat. Thank you very much. Louis, take it away.
Okay, so can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, I'm going to assume that you can hear me. I'm going to try to share this and figure out how to do it. This title bar is annoying. Let me see that. Okay, cool. So first of all, let me again thank the panel. I am thrilled by what has been said so far, not because I think in each presentation there were things that I loved and things that I might have said differently or disagreed with, but this is, I think, exactly why I think free speech is important, is because if you have only people who you agree with around you, I think you're not in the right place. Anyway, what I want to do in this presentation is, since I assume that many of you have already read the piece, and I also already presented many of these things on a panel, a human rights panel in ASA a few years ago. What I'd like to do here is try to move the conversation to a different piece that I am still developing for me to benefit from your comments as I continue to develop this idea of the influence of 20th century movements on free speech. So let's see. So what I'll do is just briefly talk about the old left, the new left, and then trying to think about the influence of decentralization of these movements, which I think is one of the main progenitors of what we are seeing here with cancel culture and kind of the atomization of political interests. My sort of orienting question is, how have the old left and new left priorities changed in what I'm calling the new century, which is this sort of post-free speech era that we may be going into? I hope that that's not the case, but I'm not hopeful that that isn't the case either. So, okay, so in the old left, you have trade union movements that in the article I talk a lot about. I don't mention the Pullman strike, which is on the top left here, but I talk about a lot of the wobblies in the western part of the United States that went on strike and also organized despite free speech laws. And I also talk about movements on the East Coast, including Mother Jones, and I talk about child rights, which was also part of the labor movement at that time. The old left movements had this set of concerns with them, and a lot of this is review for most of us if you're in the social movement field or in human rights. These are mostly economic rights, so labor rights, children's rights, the right to work, the right to food, farmers' rights, freedom from monopolies, right to housing, right to health, medical care, social security, right to education. And these were the primary driving concerns of movements at that time in the United States, because these were the major problems. People weren't able to get access to food, or people were being kicked off of their farms, or monopoly capitalism in the form of railroad tycoons or banking monopolies and other kinds of monopolies, telephone monopolies, etc., were hampering the ability of other people to enter the marketplace, and also the ability of consumers to afford goods, because these monopolies were able to raise prices, which is something that we're again seeing. This slide. Okay. This seems to shift with the new left. A lot of those concerns continued into the new left, but the new left had a sort of separate set of concerns, which included these, the civil rights movement, which of course we know these are not exclusive. The civil rights movement we can really date back to even the Civil War period, but it's more centrally associated with the new left, civil liberties, environmentalism, etc. Okay, so these movements seem to be more identitarian, more cultural in nature, and less economic, because some of those concerns had already been resolved in the New Deal and other legislation that had been passed. Okay, this is also a review, so I'm going to skip this, and I'm not sure why my slides aren't working as well as having all kinds of problems today. All right. So one of the things that I think is happening here is the process of decentralization. Whereas I think that movements of the old left and the new left had hierarchical organizations. Think of the civil rights movement organizations. Think of the labor unions. Think of even peace networks that were also organized as 501c3s with board of directors, and had meetings with people who paid membership dues and that sort of thing. We're moving from that model of organizing, or we I think already have moved from that process of organizing to a much more atomistic form of organizing, where people are organizing online, and even people who organize online do so and using various different tactics people do still organize in person or have, so we still have strikes such as those taking place, for example, in Europe. We have academic strikes taking place there, or teacher strikes that are taking place in the United States. We have anti-COVID lockdown protests happening in China right now, et cetera. So there's still also protests that are taking place in person, but those also are not taking place necessarily or primarily through a membership organization with membership dues, et cetera, but rather are taking place or being organized individually or through small groups, small networks. Instead of paying membership dues, they're communicating through newsletters. They're communicating using various apps and through or even in person using Bluetooth to share files when they get together. When they get together in person, they share things electronically. If we have time, maybe we could talk about some of those tactics. But one of the reasons I think that this change from modes of organizing in the 20th century and why they care so much about free speech and why this is changing is perhaps the hypothesis. I'm not quite sure that this is the case, but perhaps due to the way that we organize. So some of the theories that I'm thinking about with this idea, which I'm still developing and which I would love your feedback on, is these theories about how social movements organize, or where, more specifically, where the power of movements lie, which is in disruption. And sometimes disruption is illegal, or oftentimes it can be illegal. And in order for disruption to be useful or even possible as a social movement tactic, social movement actors and networks are having to be able to coordinate that kind of activity. So the theories that I'm focusing on or building upon are those that focus on disruption, or that part of social movements that disrupt, rather than social movement theories that focus on other things, which are also useful, but not central to what I think is happening in the change of what's happening with movement attitudes towards free speech. So again, the question that I think people might want to think about, or which you might share, because this is what I'm thinking about, is how have old left and new left priorities changed? And I think that they clearly have changed. And the article is about that, and I'm not going to rehash the cancel culture part of the article, which I think Gabby did a great job in illustrating that, and also Alwyn as well did a good job in illustrating that part of it. There is, I think, an anger against cancel culture, which has gone too far, and also a break from the traditions of, especially the new left, in terms of allowing people to say whatever they want. And so, but my question isn't really about whether that has happened or not. When I first presented this at ASA, and when I've been talking about it since, people initially told me that cancel culture did not exist, that it was a right-wing talking point, and that I was incorrect in pointing it out. And that's clearly not true now. And so I'm, for those of you who may still think that it doesn't exist, or that it's a right-wing talking point, I'm no longer engaging with that. I'm now moving on to thinking about how that has happened, how this change has happened from the movements that relied on free speech to the movements we have today. So here's my contact information, and most of you can just Google me and to figure out how to get that. And now I have to figure out how to get out of this without sharing. But yeah, thank you. I also want to comment briefly on the presentations that were made. I think that these presentations model what I think sociology and academia in general should be doing, which is to put people with different perspectives on the same panel to have a fuller understanding of an issue, which I think we've kind of come away from doing. And instead, we're sort of prioritizing certain kinds of views. And so I thank you for panelists for prioritizing that. And also the courage that I also want to thank them for the courage that it takes to talk about these issues, because people have very strong views. obviously on the topic of free speech, some people refuse to engage on it or judge you based on that topic, regardless of your actual politics. So I just saw the stop share button. And that's really why I was delaying. So I was trying to look for the stop share button. So thank you for having the courage to also talk about this. So I'm going to turn this over to Nick, who might coordinate the Q&A, and then I can sort of chime in when necessary.
Sure. So this is a little bit of an unorthodox situation we've got here, in that it's a general panel discussion coming from a variety of different perspectives. So let's start, I suppose, by seeing on a first round if there are any questions from the floor here. And you can either raise your hand and be recognized or put it in the chat and I will read it out. I see Michael Schwartz. Oh, I thought you were raising your hand, Michael. He was not. Okay. Okay, well, I have one thing that I thought that occurred to me in listening to these very, very divergent presentations, actually a couple of different things that I thought I'd throw out there, which is this is Ann Orloff says, I'd like to hear the panelists comment on each other's talks. And I would like to do something very similar in terms of stirring things up. And I'd like to do that in a couple of different ways. The first is that I'm all for bringing together divergent viewpoints, but of course, what that risks is incommensurability, talking past one another, not talking about the same object, and so on and so on and so on. So when we're talking about contemporary First Amendment and free speech politics, specifically contemporary First Amendment politics, one of the things that strikes me is we're talking about it in really, really different valences. And let me just point out one that really sticks out to me. The First Amendment is the protection of explicit utterances, but a lot of what we're talking about, a lot of what I heard in the presentations was, particularly from AunRika and Gabriel, for example, was about sublimation, was about repression, was about finding oblique ways to say the unsayable, to express libidinal impulses, and so on and so on and so on. And I'm not sure how that squares directly with the conversation about the First Amendment. And then on the other hand, I see Lewis and Alwyn doing something very different, which is fundamentally much more about the organization of protections of free speech, of speaking out, and the policing of speech. So I guess I just wonder, in the spirit of Anne's requests that we have that we talk towards each other, what do you guys think of each other's presentations? What do you guys think the points of articulation are? So why don't we take that first, and then I see a couple of other questions trickling in, and then we'll go to those.
Sure, I can start, and then I see AunRika just raised her hand as well. Well, I loved all of them. I want to start with Veridiana, even though she left. But one question I have for that presentation is, she is really great on the technical aspects of this and how governments and corporations use tools to restrict speech and restrict activists, especially abroad, but also in the U.S. And so I think with she was talking about metadata and facial recognition, et cetera, which is coming here. I mean, well, by here, I mean the U.S. It's coming. And so I think one question I would have for her is the influence of central bank digital currencies, which is also coming. And so when they control then our money, how are activists going to engage in, raise money for causes if their bank can just get turned off, if they see a donation to some group that is anti-government, left or right. how are we supposed to get around that, and how do we, what are the tactics that we can for Gabriel Nora Brahm, which was also a presentation I also love. I shy away from. So your presentation also focused on the cancel culture aspect of the article, whereas I focused here, at least, on the old left, new left parts of it, and trying to push those movements, which I love, back into that direction. I do sort of indirectly call the change Kafkaesque by using the term metamorphosis, and that's true. And I also dropped some, I use fuck and anal sex, because, well, I just wanted to get those words into context, into an ASA journal. But which is, I wanted to embody the movement of free speech, which includes, the use of those kinds of words, et cetera. But it wasn't just that. I was also making a point about, well, just because you may be offended by these words doesn't mean, which is the point that you are trying to elaborate on, which you did elaborate on. But one question I would have for you is, when engaging with people who, disagree with you about these issues, which I'm sure you do all the time, how does the way that we talk about it influence the way that people hear us? So, I did compare cancel culture to totalitarian movements. Is that something, to what extent is the use of that term or your use of it useful when engaging others in that debate? Okay, because of course they also, people who are pro cancel culture call people who are pro free speech totalitarian as well. To Alwyn, I'd like for you to elaborate on this kind of new, what I interpreted as, and maybe you wouldn't use this term, kind of a new political sociology, which is centered on this demographic shift on intolerance of opposing views, rather than the political sociology that we have now, which sort of assumes a society that has trust in institutions, et cetera, which we no longer do. And so perhaps you can elaborate on what that means for kind of a new political sociology. And AunRika, presentation, I keep saying that I loved, I really did love all of these. Who focused on H.G. Wells, Barnett, and horror movies, et cetera, but also drew attention to contemporary debates about critical race theory and debates around the sociological canon and et cetera. And so for you, I would say, I think that piece is often lost when we talk about free speech, that free speech, when we talk about it today, people seem to think about it as allowing Nazis to speak or not. But in the 20th century, for Black people and for Black women especially, freedom of speech was about allowing them to publish their newspaper or their film or to act in a movie or to produce their comedy albums, etc. And so how do we sort of disentangle the ways in which the free speech issue affects traditionally marginalized people, and how it affects people who have traditionally benefited from saying whatever they want, namely, racist, etc. So that's I'm asking you because I don't know the answer to that question, and people often ask me that question. So I'll stop there.
Can I?
Oh, you also, my student also has a question. His name is Caio. He's at the University.
Hi everyone. I'm too a sociologist from Brazil. I only have a little provocation about these two sides of freedom of speech. Well, David Duke is alive, and he frequently talks in Fox News, I think. I don't know how you allow this. And Malcolm X is dead. So how? Why? I don't know how the United States allowed this, because we were talking about this, and the professor said freedom of speech is very American. I don't see it that way, because the first law on censorship we had here was because of a military dictatorship imposed by the United States, you know. So this provocation about these two sides of the question of free speech as something equal in form. I don't know if this makes sense in English, but equal in form, but for everyone. But the difference of the content is important, you know. That makes sense. Thank you. Thank you.
It's a great question. Forgive me for jumping in, but I can't contain myself. I, for one, wish that it was the other way around, that David Duke was dead and Malcolm X was with us.
AunRika, you have your hand up.
Yes, this might be faux pas. I assume I'm one of the divergents in multiple ways. So I'm happy to do some interpretive work, because I did not think I was diverging from I think some central aspects of the paper of being about a public and politicized understanding of social movements, thinking about culture and the relationship between religion and social movements, and how that is relating to one, I felt like Veridiana's, I was explicitly discussing how the 19th to 20th century object in particular of horror and the racialization of horror as a socialization and political process, in particular where white people are disremembering a print form of political speech that is happening at a time period that was highlighted in the paper, 1891. The very present, if you all read the paper, the emphasis by Professor Esparza on Mother Jones, an Irish Catholic, much of the paper focusing on religion, in some ways at the character and case level, but what it means to explicitly as Black women in different social media forms, such as certainly, I could have said, 20th, 21st century Shirley Chisholm, the runs for president. There's a way that I could have sort of narrated the history, but I wanted to emphasize the ways that a sort of shift of print to image is a political process, and as a form of social change, it matters which cultural perspective the camera is representing, and that image is in fact a form of political speech. It's not particularly protected under First Amendment rights, but things like the Black Lives Matter movement, the women leadership, the Black women leadership particularly talk about the imaging of violence and collective violence against Blacks. I think like Alwyn's presentation, I was focusing on the organization of racial violence in the United States and how explicitly that happens in a sociological way that would be interesting if we paid attention to Black women's narratives of the Black Reconstruction. In that part of the presentation, my focus of the unit was the discipline, a comparative history of racial violence and how they produce knowledge against that, if you will. For me, for the sort of, as I think ending, the emphasis, I think like the presentation with Gabriel of resisting a certain kind of secular narrative of social change. So I think an interpretive work there of centralizing religion and racial capitalism, like I'm sorry, I missed your name, but the theme of death, right? I would interpret your question as Clarence Thomas is a Supreme Court judge and Anita Hill is a professor, right? That's how I would interpret that question of the role of death and resurrection and a religious ritual, and how this is constantly missing from political economic theories of not only violence, but social change. So I wanted to make those points of how I think not psychologizing or internalizing that for your citizen can lead to a specific emphasis on the role of religion and racial capitalism.
Alwyn.
Yeah, so thank you. So AunRika, I was actually wondering if you've noticed any sort of generational change or shift in responses to some of the things that you've studied. And I want to get back to Lewis's point earlier just now about maybe having sort of a new political sociology. So Lewis, in your presentation, you sort of talked about the differences between the old left and the new left. And if you're kind of interested in sort of social movements and how they orient themselves, wouldn't you also want to consider the old right and the new right as well? How maybe some of these movements themselves have adopted social movement sort of strategies themselves. And I think, it's quite worth doing that because it's a pity that Michael Schwartz, couldn't join us for this discussion. Michael used to be on that. So Lewis, I don't know if you remember this. There was this book that was published at the time, The 50 Most Dangerous Professors in the United States, and Michael was one of them. I mean, the sort of the sort of suggestion was that you have all these dangerous leftist professors that are shutting down free speech. But obviously, Michael was the complete opposite of that. He would allow, anyone the complete freedom of speech to say whatever they wanted. So, has that been sort of a shift? I mean, if you could say that, Michael represented sort of the old left, has the new left kind of, shifted in its kind of relationship and its orientation to the freedom of speech?
Okay, I'm going to suggest that we follow on this in the spirit of fostering discussion. There are a couple of questions in the chat, but why don't we continue this broader discussion for 5 or 6 more minutes, and then unfortunately, I think we'll be at time. So, Gabriel, you look like you want to come in.
I would like to say that since Clarence Thomas was mentioned, I wonder what people think about the fact that his book, his autobiography, My Grandfather's Son, which I've had the privilege to read and also to listen to him read on Audible, and I recommend this to everyone. It's an unforgettable experience. This is an experience of America that is authentic, and I think underappreciated. His first language wasn't exactly even English. I'm sorry, my own ignorance. I can't explain it better, but a dialect from where he was born and brought up in real poverty. And he has made it. My point simply is to throw out there that you cannot assign this book on American college campuses, but many, many incoming students, by contrast, as freshmen, will receive a book by Trevor Noah, the South African comedian, as exemplary somehow of Blackness. That's it. That's my point. I'm sorry to laugh almost in despair, because if you read the Thomas book, I think you'll see it's a much more substantial work, but it's politically incorrect and it will never be assigned. And wherever you stand politically, part of what I love about tonight's meeting that I attribute to Lewis's work, which has brought us together, is that this is a truly diverse, intellectually diverse panel and assembly, and it's something rare nowadays. I haven't experienced this in a while, and for me, this is exemplary of what scholarship and academia and public space should be. I would just again quickly throw out that I was struck by Alwyn's 90% statistic in terms of some demographics and areas of production like social media, I think, or high tech, 90%, I guess, left liberal. That's like in academia in the humanities, it's like 40-1 or something, left to right in the humanities and social sciences, if I'm not mistaken. So again, that's a simple fact. I don't know what people make of it. Jordan Peele's wife, by the way, is an old friend, the sister of one of my students, Jonah Peretti, who founded BuzzFeed, but that's neither here nor there. But a little something for Black Jewish relations, I guess. And incest, quickly. I know of a story all too well of a faculty member who went through a terrible investigation of the Kafkaesque kind for signing Sophocles, Oedipus, and having a student, an upset person, I don't know what the PC term is, but a student prone to be upset, accused the faculty of promoting incest. So I guess I kind of want to throw back it out there is how people find it possible to deal with these topics. I'm encouraged, AunRika, that you're dealing with this topic, partly because I know of a case where someone was actually more or less pushed into removing this stuff from their syllabus just because when a student complained, according to DEI regulations and so on, there had to be an investigation and it was just too Kafkaesque. So those are my thoughts.
Any of our other panelists want to share some final reflections?
I do want to respond, just because my panelists are professors. I am going all up on tour is how I say it. I don't say on the market. But like going on tour, hopefully next year, 2024, 2024, but I really just appreciate being able, again, when I came into graduate school and looking at all of the recordings from like ancient higher education history, like the 1950s and 1960s recordings of panels that are on YouTube. And it was such a diverse and what I now know is called interdisciplinary, and that's why I liked them so much. So I do appreciate being here, being able to speak on different scales, units of analysis, and analytical methods on the topic of free speech in interpersonal, and mass communication. One of the trends to this point about how careful I needed to be was there have been several books written on the topic of child sexual abuse and child sexual offenders, and people have had their contracts removed, professors have been dismissed. It's a lot of reproductive violence that is happening in higher education, which for me contributes to a conspiracy of silence. So that's why I really want to talk about incest in relationship to censorship, right? Most people are being educated on campuses about incest, if at all, through a rights-based language that is not based on reproductive justice, but it's human rights or reproductive rights. And I want to shout out the research on reproductive justice that demonstrates that it takes into account colonial and post-colonial forms of sexual violence that show up in complex systems like in racially minoritized families. In particular, reproductive justice frameworks capture much better than consent or any other rights-based framework the experiences of Indigenous and Black women who are particularly in this kind of legal narrative, vulnerable structurally to incest and child sexual abuse because they were not considered in sort of the legal construction. Forget the amendments, right? Like in the idea of a subject and a citizen. So I wanted to say that to the response of like transformation over time quickly, it blew my mind that people were paying to watch Game of Thrones. And that like within American racial capitalism, right? That the constant critique is like, there's no morals in literature, there's no morals in fiction. And so here, this becomes the censorship color line, if you will, is that on Twitter, you can actively see people doing something called shipping incest relationships. I ship brother, sister. It's prevalent in anime, animated films from all over, not just America. But it's a public theater oral history. It seems to be this kind of story that must be told within a performance theater, what is called fantasy in science fiction, but it's a performative narrative. It's very difficult to discuss incest within a legal and rights-based framework. But when in a performance and public arts model, you have a lot of agency, and that's what gets segregated within campuses as humanities. There's no humanities in consent-based sexual assault trainings. They don't give you a book to read. There's no bibliography. So for me, that's how the censorship shows up, and these changes over time. You can't, in the most active times where Me Too is happening, there's no representation of incest and child sexual abuse survivors. Like, that's terrifying to me, that you can come so far on some forms of the incest and abortion rights issue, but you can't read or produce social scientific knowledge about it without being at risk of losing your job or seen as a pro-sex offender. It's so yeah.
Well, on that cheery note, I think that brings us to an end. Thank you very much to all of our panel participants. Once again, this was produced jointly with the Comparative Historical Analysis and Theory Network, aka CHAT. If you'd like to join our mailing list, please go to comparativehistorical.org. Thank you very much, and see you guys next time. Bye-bye.